I did not find out about the solar project on my land until I saw the machines already working. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and I have spent most of my life trusting that property lines meant something in this country. Until the morning I drove out to my acreage outside Harris County and saw a construction crew installing industrial solar arrays across open fields that had belonged to my family long before any homeowners association ever existed nearby. The sun was still low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the metal frames already partially assembled, and the sound of drilling equipment echoed through the land like something permanent was being built without permission. I parked my truck near the edge of the access road and just watched for a moment, trying to understand how something this large could happen without a single call, letter, or authorization from me. Workers moved with confidence, reading from plans clipped to boards, guided by stakes already driven deep into my soil. That was the first moment I realized this was not a misunderstanding. It was an operation already in motion. I stepped out of the truck and walked closer, the ground dry under my boots, the smell of hot metal and dust mixing in the air as generators hummed steadily across the field. One of the supervisors glanced at me briefly but did not stop working, as if my presence was irrelevant to whatever authority had already approved this project. That was when I noticed the sign near the staging area, a large printed notice referencing Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association and a renewable energy partnership valued at $7.5 million. My name was not on it. My signature was not on it. Yet it was my land beneath every panel frame they were assembling. I returned to my truck and sat there with the engine off, looking across the property line that I had always believed was absolute. The more I studied the layout, the more I noticed how organized the operation was, how survey markers had been placed weeks earlier without my knowledge, how temporary access paths had already been cleared through sections of my acreage, as if permission had already been granted somewhere else. By midday, I contacted my attorney, a man who had handled every title dispute I had ever encountered, and I gave him one instruction: verify everything immediately. While I waited for his response, I drove the perimeter of the property, documenting every section where equipment had crossed into my boundary. The scale of it was what made it difficult to process, not because it was chaotic, but because it was structured, coordinated, and fully funded. Later that afternoon, my attorney called back, and his tone changed as he read through the county records and deed filings in real time. He confirmed what I already suspected but had not fully accepted yet. There was no recorded easement, no commercial authorization, and no legal approval for any energy lease on my land. The agreement being used to justify everything had no binding authority over the property I owned outright. I sat in silence after the call ended, looking back at the construction site where solar panels continued to rise in orderly rows under the afternoon light. It was no longer a question of confusion or error. It was a system operating under a claim that had never been validated. And somewhere between the paperwork and the machinery, I realized this was going to require more than questions, because what was happening on my land had already crossed into enforcement territory without anyone ever asking for consent. I did not sleep that night, not because of fear, but because of the certainty that something had already moved too far to be reversed without action. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and by the time the sun rose again over my property, the solar installation was no longer a small operation on the horizon, but an expanding industrial footprint stretching deeper into my land than I had initially observed. I drove out early, crossing the gravel road in silence, watching as more equipment had arrived overnight, including additional trucks, portable storage units, and marked vehicles tied to Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association. The scale of coordination made it clear that this was not a spontaneous misunderstanding. It was a structured deployment based on an agreement I had never been part of. When I stepped out of my truck, I could hear voices calling out measurements, confirming positions, and adjusting installation lines as if every marker on my land had already been validated by authority. I walked slowly through the edge of the site, not interrupting, just observing how deeply the assumption of permission had already been embedded into their workflow. One of the supervisors finally approached me, holding a clipboard with printed diagrams showing parcel overlays and proposed energy layouts. He spoke respectfully, explaining that they were operating under an approved community solar initiative and that the project had been cleared for installation across designated sections of land tied to Willowbrook Reserve infrastructure planning. I asked him one question: who approved access to private acreage outside the designated subdivision boundary? He hesitated, then referred me to the document package provided by the homeowners association, which he believed confirmed authorization. I took photographs of everything he showed me without responding further, because at that moment I understood the real problem was not the crew on my land, but the paper trail they had been given. By midday, I met with my attorney in person at a small office near the county courthouse. He had already pulled updated filings, cross-referenced survey records, and contacted the county recorder for clarification. The results were more definitive than before. There was no legal instrument granting Willowbrook Reserve authority to execute or authorize any commercial solar lease on my property. The agreement they were referencing was either misapplied or structurally invalid in relation to my parcel designation. My attorney used very precise language when he explained it, emphasizing that the presence of a contract in their system did not equate to enforceable rights over privately held land. While we reviewed the documents together, he began preparing an emergency notice to halt all unauthorized development activity, pending immediate legal enforcement review. I returned to the property before sunset and observed that the construction had not slowed. If anything, it had accelerated. Additional panels were being aligned, trenching equipment was active in new sections, and boundary stakes had been extended further into my acreage. It was at that moment I realized the situation had entered a phase where operational momentum was continuing independently of legal validity. That is when my attorney called again and informed me that he had escalated the matter to county enforcement authorities, requesting immediate issuance of a stop work order based on verified ownership records. He explained that deputies would be dispatched to physically serve the order on site and ensure compliance. I ended the call and stayed near the edge of the property, watching the sun drop behind rows of partially installed solar structures. There was no confrontation yet, no resolution, only the quiet build-up toward enforcement. And in that silence, I understood that what was about to happen would not be decided by argument, but by the simple act of documentation meeting reality at the exact point where assumptions could no longer operate. I arrived at the property before dawn, not because I expected anything to change, but because I needed to witness the situation in its most unfiltered state before enforcement arrived. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and the first thing I noticed as I drove along the gravel access road was that the solar installation site looked even more established than it had the day before, as if the absence of official intervention overnight had been interpreted as silent permission to continue. Rows of partially completed solar arrays now stretched deeper into my acreage, with additional lighting systems and temporary power units placed along newly cleared paths that had not existed on any survey map I had reviewed. The air was filled with mechanical hums and the sound of coordinated activity, workers moving with the confidence of people who believed their authority was already validated somewhere outside of my control. I parked near the edge of the construction zone and stepped out, observing how the entire operation functioned as a single synchronized system. No one appeared uncertain, no one paused to question boundaries, and that level of operational certainty told me everything I needed to know about how deeply the misunderstanding had been institutionalized. Within minutes, my attorney called again, informing me that county enforcement had confirmed dispatch of deputies to serve a formal stop work order on site. He explained that once the order was physically delivered, all construction activity would be required to cease immediately under county code enforcement authority, pending full legal review of property access violations. I acknowledged the information without interruption and continued observing the site, because I wanted to understand how a system behaves in the exact moment before it is forced to reconcile with legal reality. Around mid-morning, I noticed movement at the entrance road. 2 county vehicles arrived first, followed by a marked enforcement unit. Their presence changed the atmosphere instantly, not through force, but through recognition. Workers gradually slowed their activity as the vehicles approached, and conversations became more focused, less directional. I remained at a distance as a deputy stepped out and requested to see the project authorization documents. The interaction was procedural, calm, and precise. The representative from Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association arrived shortly after, carrying a folder of printed agreements and project summaries, attempting to present the solar lease as a valid operational contract under Community Development Authority. The deputy reviewed the documents carefully, comparing them against the property records he had been provided by county administration. I could see the shift in his posture as he read, not abrupt, but methodical, as each page confirmed what legal verification had already suggested. After several minutes of review, he issued the stop work order directly at the site, stating clearly that all construction activities must cease immediately due to lack of verified authorization for use of privately owned land. The announcement was not dramatic, but its effect was immediate. Equipment that had been operating continuously moments before began powering down. Workers stepped back from installation points, and supervisors began organizing equipment shutdown procedures. The solar arrays that had been expanding steadily across my land now stood frozen mid-progress, suspended in a state of incomplete execution. The representative from Willowbrook Reserve attempted to raise objections regarding contractual validity and community impact, but the deputy redirected the discussion back to jurisdictional authority, emphasizing that enforcement decisions were based solely on verified ownership records and county land use compliance. I stood quietly near the boundary line, watching as the operational structure that had been built over several days transitioned into controlled suspension within minutes. There was no confrontation beyond procedure, no escalation beyond documentation. The presence of enforcement alone was sufficient to redefine the situation completely. As the sun climbed higher, I observed crews beginning to pack equipment, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement that the operational phase had ended. My attorney confirmed over the phone that the stop work order was now fully active and legally binding, and that any further activity would constitute violation of county enforcement directives. I ended the call and looked across the property one more time. The land itself had not changed, but the system operating upon it had been reset to its actual legal foundation. And in that moment, it became clear that what had been built on assumption could not continue once documentation had finally been enforced without delay. I remained on the property for several hours after the stop work order had been issued, not because there was anything left to witness in terms of action, but because I wanted to observe how quickly a fully operational system adjusts when its assumed authority is removed. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what I saw unfold during that time was not resistance, but recalibration. Construction crews who had been actively installing solar infrastructure only hours earlier were now engaged in structured shutdown procedures, powering down equipment, securing materials, and marking unfinished sections with temporary safety indicators. The change was not chaotic. It was procedural, as if the entire operation had been waiting for a formal signal to reverse direction. Around midday, additional county personnel arrived to document compliance with the stop work order. They moved methodically across the site, recording equipment placement, verifying shutdown status, and confirming that no further installation activity was taking place. I stayed near the boundary line, watching as the presence of enforcement reshaped the entire environment without a single confrontation. The most striking part was not the cessation of work itself, but the way the narrative around the project began to unravel in real time. Representatives from Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association were still present on site, attempting to engage with county officials, presenting printed agreements and referencing the solar lease as if continued explanation could alter enforcement already in motion. However, each interaction was met with the same procedural response, that jurisdiction over property use is determined by recorded ownership and verified authorization, not by internal association agreements or assumed development rights. I noticed how quickly confidence began to shift into uncertainty, not through argument, but through the inability of documentation to support prior assumptions. By early afternoon, I walked along the edge of the construction zone and observed the extent of what had been halted. Solar panel arrays stood partially assembled across multiple sections of land, with trenches left open and equipment positioned mid-task. Everything had the appearance of a project interrupted not by force, but by verification. My attorney called again to confirm that the stop work order had been officially entered into county enforcement records and that any attempt to resume construction without legal clearance would trigger further penalties under property compliance statutes. He also informed me that the lease agreement submitted by Willowbrook Reserve was now under formal review for authority misrepresentation in relation to private land use. I did not respond immediately because I was still processing the speed at which assumed authority had collapsed once it encountered recorded fact. Later that day, I observed a meeting taking place near the site entrance between HOA representatives and legal counsel, their body language noticeably different from earlier encounters. The tone of discussion had shifted entirely from implementation to containment, with focus now on how to respond to enforcement rather than how to continue construction. I remained at a distance, noting how the presence of official documentation had replaced all prior narratives without the need for escalation. As the sun moved lower in the sky, the construction site became still, not abandoned, but suspended in legal pause. The equipment remained in place, but the operational intent had been fully neutralized by formal order. I stood at the boundary one final time before leaving, observing the transition from active development to regulated inactivity. The land itself had not changed, but the system operating upon it had been fully reset to its lawful structure. And in that realization, it became clear that what had once moved forward on assumption could no longer continue without verified authority. Because once enforcement aligns with documentation, there is no remaining space for interpretation. I returned to the property the following morning expecting to see continued enforcement activity, but instead I found a completely different atmosphere settling over the solar installation site. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what had once been a fast-moving construction zone was now reduced to a controlled staging area under county restriction. The equipment was still present, but everything had been reorganized into static positions, as if the project had been placed into suspension rather than continuation. County enforcement vehicles were parked near the main access point, and personnel were conducting final compliance checks to ensure that no unauthorized activity had resumed after the stop work order. I stood near the boundary line, observing how the entire structure of the project had shifted from expansion to containment. The silence felt different from the earlier construction noise. Not empty, but regulated, as if the land itself had been returned to a state of enforced neutrality. By mid-morning, my attorney arrived on site with additional documentation confirming that Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association had formally acknowledged receipt of the enforcement order and was now required to submit a full legal justification for any claim made under the solar lease agreement. He explained that the county had escalated the matter into a formal review of authority misrepresentation, focusing specifically on how a private land lease of this scale could have been initiated without verified ownership consent. I walked with him along the edge of the construction area while we reviewed the remaining structures, noting how incomplete installations now stood as physical records of halted authorization. The conversation was procedural, focused entirely on documentation, timelines, and jurisdictional boundaries rather than speculation or emotion. Later that day, representatives from Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association arrived again, but their presence was noticeably different from previous visits. There was no attempt to continue construction discussions, only structured legal engagement with county officials who were now fully controlling the process. I observed from a distance as they reviewed the original lease documents under supervision, and for the first time, I saw hesitation replace certainty in their responses. Every argument they presented was redirected back to one central issue: absence of recorded authority over privately owned land. As the afternoon progressed, I drove slowly through the perimeter roads surrounding my property, observing how the solar installation site now functioned as a paused project under legal oversight rather than an active development. Temporary fencing had been adjusted to reflect restricted zones, and signage referencing the Homeowners Association had been partially removed or covered with compliance notices issued by county enforcement. It was clear that operational control had fully transitioned away from private coordination and into formal jurisdictional review. I stopped at the highest point overlooking the entire acreage and looked across the rows of incomplete solar structures stretching into the distance. What once represented rapid expansion now stood frozen in legal suspension, each component waiting for authorization that would never come without verified ownership alignment. My attorney called one final time that evening to confirm that all enforcement actions were now fully documented and that no further construction activity could legally proceed until the review process concluded. I ended the call and remained outside as the light faded across the land, watching as the site settled into complete stillness. There was no conflict, no escalation, only the final state of a system corrected by documentation. And in that moment, it became clear that when legal authority is properly enforced, even the largest operations are reduced to their true status, which is either fully authorized or not authorized at all, with no space left in between. I returned to the property one final time several days after the enforcement action had stabilized, not because anything required immediate attention, but because I needed to understand the final outcome of a system that had been forced back into legal alignment. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what I observed that morning confirmed that the solar project had fully transitioned from active construction to long-term regulatory containment. The equipment that once covered large portions of my land was now partially dismantled, with rows of solar frames removed and staging areas cleared under county supervision. What remained was not a functioning energy installation, but a fragmented structure awaiting legal determination regarding removal, storage, and liability allocation. County enforcement personnel were still present, conducting final inspections and verifying that no unauthorized activity had resumed since the issuance of the stop work order. I stood near the boundary line and watched as officials documented remaining infrastructure with precise procedural attention, recording every component that had been installed without verified authorization. The atmosphere was no longer tense or uncertain. It was administrative, controlled, and final in a way that only formal documentation can create. Later that morning, my attorney arrived with the concluding update from the County Review Board. He explained that Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association had formally withdrawn its claim of operational authority over the solar lease project following confirmation that no recorded easement or commercial development right existed on my property. The lease agreement, once presented as a valid community initiative, had been reclassified under county review as an unauthorized contractual action lacking enforceable jurisdiction over privately owned land. My attorney used precise legal language when he explained the final status, emphasizing that all enforcement actions were now complete and that any remaining materials on site would be subject to standard property recovery procedures. I walked with him through the edge of the site one last time, observing how the landscape was slowly returning to its original state. Temporary fencing had been adjusted to reflect permanent boundary lines, and signage referencing the Homeowners Association had been fully removed under county instruction. The solar arrays that had once stretched across the fields now existed only in incomplete sections, their presence reduced from expansion to residual infrastructure awaiting removal or relocation under legal supervision. By midday, representatives from Willowbrook Reserve were no longer present on site. All communications had shifted into formal written correspondence through legal channels, focusing on compliance, liability closure, and documentation reconciliation. I reviewed the final report from county enforcement detailing the full timeline of intervention, from initial stop work order issuance to complete cessation of construction activity and verification of ownership boundaries. The report was procedural and absolute, containing no interpretive language, only verified findings and recorded outcomes. I drove the perimeter slowly that afternoon, noting how the land itself had begun to feel undisturbed again, as if the interruption had been temporary rather than permanent. There were no active crews, no operational equipment, and no administrative presence beyond routine county monitoring. What had once been a large-scale energy installation had been reduced entirely to a documented case file within the county system. As the sun lowered across the open acreage, I stopped near the highest ridge overlooking the entire property and reflected on how the sequence had unfolded. The process had not required escalation beyond enforcement, nor negotiation beyond verification. It had been resolved entirely through the alignment of legal record and physical reality. And in that final state of closure, it became clear that authority built on assumption cannot sustain itself once documentation is enforced, because in the end, the land does not respond to belief, it only responds to record. I returned to the property once more after the official county enforcement phase had fully concluded, not because there was any remaining legal action required, but because I wanted to see what a fully resolved dispute actually looks like on the ground when all authority has been correctly applied. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what I saw that morning was a landscape that had shifted from active industrial disruption back into controlled silence. The solar installation site no longer functioned as a construction zone. Instead, it had been reduced to a structured recovery area where remaining equipment was being cataloged, removed, or secured under county supervision for legal disposition. The open fields that had been partially converted into industrial rows of solar infrastructure were now returning to their original state, with cleared sections of land revealing the underlying terrain that had been obscured during the brief period of unauthorized development. I stood near the boundary line and observed county personnel completing final documentation checks, verifying that all enforcement directives had been fully executed and that no further construction activity remained active on my property. Their work was methodical, focused entirely on record accuracy and compliance closure, ensuring that every installed component was accounted for within the enforcement file. Later that morning, my attorney arrived with the final legal summary from the County Review Division. He explained that the case had now been formally closed at the administrative level, with Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association having submitted full acknowledgement of jurisdictional limits regarding private land use. The solar lease agreement that had initiated the entire situation was officially classified as non-enforceable under property law due to absence of recorded easement and lack of verified ownership authorization. My attorney emphasized that the final ruling was not based on interpretation or negotiation, but on direct alignment between deed records, county filings, and enforcement verification. I walked with him along the perimeter of the land, observing how the remaining traces of the project were being systematically removed. Temporary access paths that had been carved into my acreage were now being restored or closed under county supervision, and boundary markers were being re-established according to the original surveyed lines. The land itself was no longer in a transitional state. It had been returned to its documented condition without ambiguity or overlap between assumed and actual use. By midday, there were no representatives from Willowbrook Reserve present at the site. All communication had shifted entirely into formal legal correspondence, focused on final reconciliation of documentation and closure of liability exposure. I reviewed the last set of county enforcement notes provided by my attorney, which confirmed that all stop work order conditions had been fully satisfied and that no residual authorization claims remained active. I drove slowly across the property one final time, observing how the absence of machinery, personnel, and administrative activity had restored the natural scale of the land. What had once been an active industrial development was now indistinguishable from a paused project that had never reached completion under lawful authority. As the afternoon light stretched across the fields, I stopped near the highest point overlooking the entire acreage and reflected on how the sequence had resolved itself entirely through documentation and enforcement rather than confrontation. The outcome had not required escalation beyond legal procedure, because once verified records were applied without delay, every assumed structure collapsed under the weight of its own lack of authorization. And in that final moment of clarity, it became evident that when law and land are properly aligned, no system built on assumption can continue to exist beyond the point where documentation takes effect. I returned to the property one final time a week after the enforcement phase had officially closed, not because there was any remaining legal uncertainty, but because I wanted to confirm that the system had fully stabilized back into its natural, documented state. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what I found that morning was a landscape that no longer carried any trace of active dispute, only the final evidence of a correction that had already been completed through formal authority. The solar installation site had been fully cleared of operational activity, with most of the remaining infrastructure removed or transported off-site under county supervision. The open fields of my property were visible again in full scale, uninterrupted by construction equipment or administrative presence, as if the entire incident had been a temporary overlay on a much older and more permanent legal reality. I walked slowly along the perimeter road, observing how even the smallest signs of the project had been systematically addressed. Temporary access paths had been restored to their original condition, and any markings that had been placed during the unauthorized development phase were either removed or officially documented as part of the enforcement record. The land itself felt unchanged in structure, but completely different in how it had been returned to use, no longer interpreted through assumptions of shared authority, but strictly through recorded ownership boundaries. Later that morning, my attorney arrived with the final closure documentation from county enforcement. He explained that the case had been fully resolved at every administrative level, with Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association submitting formal acknowledgement that no enforceable rights existed to support the solar lease agreement on private land. The document had been finalized after a full review of deed records, county filings, and enforcement actions, confirming that all prior activity on my property had been executed without valid legal authorization. My attorney emphasized that the closure report was definitive, meaning no further claims or appeals could be initiated under the current jurisdictional framework. I reviewed the paperwork carefully, noting how every section referenced procedural compliance rather than interpretation, reinforcing that the outcome was based entirely on verified documentation rather than negotiation or settlement. By midday, I conducted one last full drive across the property boundary, observing how the land had returned completely to its natural state. The areas that had once been occupied by solar infrastructure were now indistinguishable from surrounding terrain, with only subtle traces of temporary activity remaining in soil patterns that would eventually fade with time. There were no personnel on site, no enforcement vehicles, and no administrative activity remaining beyond routine county record maintenance. I stopped at the highest elevation point overlooking the entire acreage and looked across the full expanse of land that had defined every stage of the situation from the beginning. The silence was no longer procedural or temporary. It was final in a structural sense, as if the entire system had completed its correction cycle and no further adjustment was required. I thought back through the entire sequence, from the first moment I discovered construction activity to the final enforcement order that halted it completely, and what stood out most was how consistently the outcome had been determined not by conflict, but by documentation applied without delay. There had been no need for escalation beyond legal procedure, because once recorded ownership and county enforcement aligned, every assumption collapsed under its own lack of validity. As the afternoon light stretched across the fields, I remained standing for a moment longer before turning back toward my vehicle. The property no longer felt like it had been reclaimed. It felt like it had simply been restored to what it had always been under law, uninterrupted, clearly defined, and no longer subject to interpretation beyond what the record already confirmed. I returned to the property one final time not out of necessity, but out of confirmation, because in my experience, real resolution is never felt in the moment it is declared, but in the moment it proves itself through stability. My name is Ryan Mitchell, and what I saw that morning confirmed that the entire situation had fully transitioned from legal conflict into permanent structural resolution under county enforcement authority. The land stretched across the horizon in complete stillness, with no remaining signs of solar construction, no machinery, and no administrative presence beyond standard county boundary monitoring. What had once been a large-scale, unauthorized development had been reduced entirely to a documented case that no longer had physical expression on the property itself. I walked slowly along the perimeter road, observing how the terrain had fully returned to its original condition, with open fields uninterrupted by equipment or infrastructure, and boundary markers reflecting only surveyed property lines that had always existed in the official record. There was a sense of finality in the environment, not emotional, but procedural, as if the land itself had been placed back into alignment with its legal definition. Later that morning, my attorney arrived with the final closure packet from county administration, containing the last formal statements regarding enforcement completion. He explained that Willowbrook Reserve Homeowners Association had submitted full written acknowledgement that the solar lease agreement held no enforceable authority over privately owned land, and that all prior claims had been formally withdrawn under legal review. The documentation confirmed that every stage of enforcement had been completed according to statutory procedure, including stop work order execution, site verification, compliance confirmation, and final administrative closure. My attorney emphasized that this was not a negotiated settlement, but a legal conclusion based entirely on recorded property rights and county jurisdictional limits. I reviewed the final report in detail, noting how each section reinforced the same principle that had governed the entire process from the beginning, that ownership is not defined by usage, assumption, or internal agreements, but by documented record and enforceable law. By midday, I completed one final drive across the property, observing how completely the site had returned to its natural state. The areas that had once been filled with solar installation activity were now indistinguishable from surrounding terrain, with only faint indications of temporary disturbance that would eventually disappear with time. There were no remaining personnel, no equipment, and no visible administrative activity. Even the access points that had once been used to justify entry had been formally closed or restored under county supervision, leaving only the established boundary lines as the sole reference for land division. I stopped at the highest point of the property and looked across the entire expanse one last time, reflecting on how the entire sequence had unfolded from unauthorized construction to full legal correction. What remained most clear was not the scale of the operation or the speed of enforcement, but the consistency of the outcome once documentation was properly applied. There had been no need for escalation beyond procedural enforcement because the legal record had always contained the final answer. As the afternoon light moved across the fields, I stood in silence and recognized that the situation had not ended in victory or defeat, but in alignment. The land had not changed ownership at any point. It had only been temporarily misrepresented through assumption until the record corrected the interpretation. And in that understanding, the entire experience resolved into a single principle that remained long after everything else had cleared, that when verified law is applied without delay, even the most complex disputes collapse into clarity, and what remains is only what was always legally true.